March 4th, 1968. A small luncheonette on Wells Avenue in Harlem, New York. Late in the evening, an old man sits at the counter with a plate of food he barely touches. He is dressed sharply, like always, in a gray suit, a clean shirt, and cufflinks. He is talking with two detectives who have known him for 20 years, men who used to arrest him and now just come to talk. He laughs at something, then he stops laughing. He puts a hand on his chest. He slides off the stool onto the floor of the diner, and by the time anyone reaches him, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, the man Harlem called Bumpy, is gone. 62 years old, no bullet, no poison, no rival standing over him with a smile, just a heart that had carried too much weight for too many years, finally giving out over a plate of soul food in a diner he had eaten at 100 times before. Here is the part almost nobody talks about. For nearly 30 years, one of the most dangerous men in organized crime in New York had tried to put Bumpy Johnson in the ground and failed every single time. Not through one big war, through a long, patient, decades-long campaign, using cops, using rivals, using federal agents, using his own family, trying every angle a man can try to remove another man from the earth. And in the end, it was the hunter who lost everything. His empire, his freedom, his own people, while the man he hunted died an old man, at peace, surrounded by a neighborhood that loved him so much that thousands of people lined the streets of Harlem for his funeral. This is the story of that hunt, and how it turned into one of the strangest backfires in the history of American organized crime. Most people who know the name Bumpy Johnson know the short version. Harlem numbers boss, sharp dresser, feuded with Dutch Schultz, went to Alcatraz, died at a diner counter. That short version leaves out the part that actually explains everything else about his life, which is the fact that almost the entire second half of it was spent under a slow, deliberate siege from a man most people have never heard of, a man who never once fired a shot at him and never needed to. The weapon of choice was not a gun. It was paperwork, patience, and the willingness to wait an entire generation to win. To understand it, you have to go back to Charleston, South Carolina, where a boy named Ellsworth Johnson was born, in 1905, into a family that had already buried two sons to lynch mobs. His parents sent him north to live with his sister in Harlem when he was still a teenager, hoping New York would be safer than the Jim Crow South. Harlem, in the 1920s, was its own kind of world, a black city inside a white one, with its own economy, its own churches, its own newspapers, and its own underground. The boy grew into a wiry, sharp-dressed young man with a hunched back from an old injury, which is where the nickname came from, Bumpy. He was smart in a way that stood out immediately. He read constantly. He played chess in the park for money and rarely lost. And he found his way into the numbers game, the illegal lottery that ran through every block of Harlem, controlled at the time by a woman named Madame Stephanie St. Clair, one of the only black crime bosses of her era to run her own operation without answering to anyone. Bumpy became her top enforcer, and then her partner, and Harlem watched him rise. He was polite. He quoted poetry. He tipped generously. He also carried a straight razor and was not afraid to use it. That combination, gentleman and gangster, was what made him different from every boss who came before him. Shopkeepers on 7th Avenue would tell you he never raised his voice at anyone who did not deserve it. Old women at church would tell you he paid for funerals and school clothes and never once mentioned it to anyone else. Young men on the corner would tell you a different story, about a man who could end an argument with a look and never had to repeat himself twice. Both versions were true at the same time, and that was exactly the point. When the white gangster Dutch Schultz tried to move in on the numbers racket in the 1930s and push out the black operators who had built it, it was Bumpy who organized the resistance. And it was Bumpy who came out standing when Schultz was gunned down in a New Jersey chop house in 1935. After that, Harlem's numbers game came under new terms. The Italian families downtown, led at the time by men like Lucky Luciano, made an arrangement. Bumpy would run in Harlem. He would answer to nobody uptown, but he would owe a piece of the action to the families downtown, and he would owe them loyalty. For a while, That arrangement worked. Bumpy became something close to royalty in Harlem, a man who could walk into any church, any barbershop, any nightclub, and be treated like family. He married a woman named May, sharp and quiet, and fiercely protective of the life they were building, and together they kept a home that looked, from the outside, almost ordinary. Neighbors described a man who read late into the night, who loved chess more than almost anything, who could sit for an hour talking about history or philosophy and never once mention the business that paid for the roof over his head. That contrast, the gentle husband at home and the boss who ran an entire underground economy in the street, is part of what made him so hard for his enemies to predict. This is where the man who would spend 3 decades hunting him enters the story. Down in the world of the Italian families, there was a rising capo, ambitious, cold, patient in a way that made even his own people nervous. For this story, we will call him by the name his own crew used behind his back, the Undertaker, because of how quietly he made his problems disappear. The Undertaker did not like the arrangement with Harlem. He believed the numbers racket, and later the far more profitable heroin trade moving through the city, belonged entirely to the families downtown, and that a black boss running his own territory, answering to nobody, taking a smaller cut than the families felt he should, was an insult that could not stand forever. He was not interested in Bumpy's manners or his poetry. He saw a man in his way. The Undertaker's first move came quietly, the way most of his moves did. In the late 1930s, he began feeding information to police contacts about Bumpy's operations, timed carefully to hit right when Bumpy's numbers business was at its most profitable. It worked. Bumpy was arrested and convicted on narcotics charges in 1937 and sent away for years. He would later say the case against him was thin, built more on reputation than on real evidence. The kind of case that gets built when someone wants you gone, rather than when someone wants justice. He served his time without saying a word about who might have pointed the finger. When he came home, he went right back to work, and the Undertaker tried again. The pattern repeated itself for years. Bumpy would rebuild, and somehow, right when his business was strongest, a case would appear. A raid would happen at exactly the wrong moment. A trusted lieutenant would turn out to be talking to the district attorney's office. Bumpy did 14 years total across different sentences over the decades, a huge portion of his adult life spent behind bars, first at Clinton Correctional, then later at the federal penitentiary at Alcatraz, one of the only black inmates ever held on the Rock. Transferred there specifically because authorities considered him too influential to leave in a regular prison where he might keep running things from inside. Every time, the fingerprints on these setups led back, quietly, carefully, to the same downtown crew. Bumpy knew. Harlem knew. Nobody said it out loud, because saying it out loud in that world was its own kind of death sentence. Life on the Rock was its own kind of test. Alcatraz in those years held some of the most notorious men in the country, and a black boss from Harlem stood out immediately, isolated in a way that was clearly intentional. Guards who later spoke about that period described a man who kept to himself, who read constantly, who never gave the staff a reason to write him up, almost as if he understood that his best weapon against the people trying to break him was simply refusing to be broken. He wrote letters to Mamie that guards were required to read before they were sent, letters that talked about books and chess strategy and never once complained about the man who had put him there. Whether that restraint was patience or pride, the people who knew him best said it was probably both. What made the Undertaker's campaign so effective for so long was that he never went for the obvious move. He never sent a shooter to Bumpy's front door, because he understood something important. Bumpy Johnson was not just a man. He was an idea that half of Harlem had built its self-respect around, a black man from the South who came north with nothing and built something the white families could not simply take. Killing him in the street would have started a war the Undertaker did not think he could win, not because Bumpy had more guns, but because Bumpy had more people. Grandmothers who fed him at their kitchen tables would have hidden his friends. Preachers who took his donations would have prayed publicly and cursed privately. Cops who liked him more than they liked the families downtown would have looked the other way for the wrong side. So instead, the Undertaker played a longer game. Prison sentences, bad information, poisoned relationships, slow strangulation instead of a single cut. When Bumpy finally came home from Alcatraz in the mid-1950s, Harlem had changed while he was gone, and so had he. He was older, slower to anger, more interested in staying alive than in proving anything to anyone. He opened a dry cleaning business and a small chain of other legitimate storefronts, partly to give himself something clean to point to, and partly because Mamie had made it clear she was tired of visiting him behind glass. But the world he had come from was not finished with him yet, and neither was the man downtown who had spent nearly 2 decades trying to remove him. By the 1950s, the game had changed. The numbers racket, while still profitable, was no longer the biggest prize in Harlem. Heroin was. And this is where the hunt turned dangerous in a new way, because heroin was not something Bumpy wanted any part of. He had watched what it did to the neighborhood he loved, watched young men who used to run errands for him turn into hollow versions of themselves, nodding off in doorways. He said more than once, to people who later repeated it, that he did not want that poison running through his own streets. The Undertaker did not share that concern. To him, heroin was simply the most profitable product the families had ever found, and Harlem, with its dense population and its existing distribution networks built by decades of numbers running, was the perfect place to move it. He needed Bumpy either controlling that pipeline for the families or out of the way entirely, so someone more cooperative could take his place. For a period, the two men reached an uneasy truce. Bumpy, worn down by years in prison, by a body that was aging faster than it should have, and by a wife, Mamie, who begged him to find a quieter life, allowed some heroin distribution to move through channels connected to his old territory, taking a cut without personally running the operation. It was a compromise that satisfied nobody completely, least of all the Undertaker, who wanted total control, not a cut shared with a black boss he considered beneath him. Federal investigators, later working narcotics cases in Harlem, would describe this period as one of the strangest arrangements they had ever tried to map. A black organized crime figure, with more community loyalty than half the police force, tolerated and used and undermined, all at the same time, by the Italian families, who could not fully control him and could not fully remove him either. Behind the scenes, the Undertaker kept working the angles he always worked. He cultivated relationships with a handful of officers in the local precincts who were willing to look past certain shipments as long as certain other shipments got flagged, always the ones connected to Bumpy's people. He funneled money to a small newspaper columnist willing to print unflattering pieces about Harlem's old numbers boss whenever it suited him, planting the idea in the public mind that Bumpy was somehow behind the very drug trade he had spent years trying to keep off his blocks. It was a slow campaign to turn Bumpy's own community against him, and for a while, it worked just well enough to keep him on edge, without ever working well enough to finish the job. The final phase of the hunt began in the early 1960s, and this is where the Undertaker made the mistake that would eventually destroy him. Growing impatient after decades of failed attempts to break Bumpy through the courts, he decided to go around him entirely, cutting deals directly with younger, more violent operators inside Harlem who were hungry for the kind of money the old numbers racket never offered, men with no loyalty to the old code Bumpy had built his reputation on. The Undertaker armed them, financed them, and let them start carving out territory in direct competition with Bumpy's remaining influence, hoping the old man would either be pushed out by his own community or be forced into a war that would finally give the families an excuse to remove him for good. It backfired almost immediately. The younger operators the Undertaker had armed were not disciplined the way Bumpy's old crew had been. They were reckless. They drew police attention. The old numbers game had spent decades learning to avoid. Shootings started happening in broad daylight over street corners, the kind of violence that gets front-page coverage and forces politicians to promise crackdowns. Federal narcotics agents, already circling the heroin pipeline running up from the ports and across the Mexican border, suddenly had exactly the kind of visible, undisciplined chaos they needed to justify a massive push into Harlem, and that push did not stay contained to the small-time operators. It followed the money upward, straight toward the families who were supplying them, straight toward men connected to the Undertaker himself. At the same time, something else was happening that the Undertaker had never accounted for. Bumpy, sensing exactly what game was being played against him, made a decision that surprised almost everyone who knew him. Instead of fighting the younger operators in the street, he began quietly cooperating with federal investigators, not as an informant in the traditional sense, never naming names in open court, but by making it clear through intermediaries which pipelines were connected to which families, letting the weight of federal law enforcement do what he had spent 30 years being too smart to do himself. He understood something the Undertaker never fully grasped. In a city that was starting to change, where public opinion on drugs and violence in black neighborhoods was becoming a political issue that Washington cared about, the old rules of silence and street justice were losing their power. The new weapon was paperwork, wiretaps, grand juries, and Bumpy, the old chess player, had simply switched boards. The younger operators the Undertaker had armed did exactly what reckless young men with guns and no oversight tend to do. They fought each other as much as they fought anyone else, splitting into smaller crews that could not agree on territory, drawing the kind of attention that made even other Harlem old-timers shake their heads. Longtime numbers runners who had worked under Bumpy for decades started quietly steering business away from the new operators and back toward anyone still connected to the old disciplined way of doing things, not out of loyalty alone, but because chaos was bad for everyone's business, and everyone in Harlem understood that lesson far better than the man financing the chaos from downtown ever did. By 1965, federal indictments connected to Harlem's heroin trade started reaching further up the chain than they ever had before, sweeping in mid-level operators who had direct financial ties back to the Undertaker's crew downtown. He was never charged directly. Himself, he was too careful for that, too many layers between him and the street. But his authority inside his own family began to crumble. The men who had once feared him started to see him as a liability, a boss whose long, obsessive campaign against a Harlem numbers king had brought federal heat down on an operation that used to run quietly for decades. In the world the Undertaker had spent his whole life in, being seen as the man who brought unwanted attention was its own kind of death sentence, even without a bullet involved. What happened next is something investigators pieced together only years later, through informants who eventually did talk once the old codes started breaking down across the city. The Undertaker was quietly pushed aside by his own family, stripped of the territories that had made him powerful, given a smaller, less prestigious piece of the business to manage, in what amounted to an organized crime version of exile. He spent his final years watching younger men run the operations he once controlled, men who had no interest in his old grudge against a Harlem boss who by then was already fading from active street life. He died in the early 1970s, not in a blaze of violence, but quietly, largely forgotten by the organization he had spent his life building, a footnote in an era of organized crime that was already collapsing under federal pressure and its own internal rot. The men who once answered to him barely mentioned his name once he was gone, which, for a man who had spent his whole career building fear as his currency, was its own kind of quiet punishment. There was no grand funeral for him, no procession of mourners lining a street to say goodbye. Just a small service attended by a handful of relatives who had long since stopped asking questions about how he made his money. Compare that to the scene on the day Harlem said goodbye to the man he had spent 30 years trying to destroy. Bumpy Johnson never knew the full extent of how it ended for the man who hunted him. By the time the Undertaker's fall was complete, Bumpy had already been gone for years, having passed away that night at the counter of the little luncheonette on Wells Avenue in 1968. What he did know, in his final years, was something quieter and in some ways more satisfying than revenge. He knew that after 3 decades of prison sentences engineered against him, informants planted around him, young rivals armed to replace him, and a heroin trade weaponized specifically to box him in. He was still the one Harlem turned out for. His funeral drew thousands of people into the streets, men in suits and women in church hats, old numbers runners and young hustlers who had never met him but had grown up hearing his name spoken like a legend. Cars lined up for blocks. People who had never once bet a nickel on his numbers game stood on the sidewalk anyway, just to see the procession pass, because to them, Bumpy Johnson had stopped being a criminal a long time ago and had become something closer to a piece of Harlem's own history. The man who had tried for 30 years to erase him from Harlem was not there, and would not have been welcome if he was. Mamie outlived him by many years, and in interviews she gave long after his death, she never spoke about him as a gangster first. She spoke about a man who read to her from books of poetry, who never once raised a hand to her, who worried more about the children in the neighborhood having enough to eat than about the money sitting in his own pocket. Whether that image was the whole truth or only the part she chose to remember, it was the version that stuck, and it was the version that outlived every case file the Undertaker had ever built against him. There is a lesson in this story that has nothing to do with guns or territory, and it is the same lesson that shows up again and again when you study how these old rivalries actually ended. The Undertaker had every advantage a man in his position could ask for: money, muscle, connections inside the police department, and 30 years of patience most people would call impressive under any other circumstance. What he never had, what he could never buy or threaten his way into, was the thing Bumpy built without even trying to build it, which was trust. An entire neighborhood that would rather protect an old numbers man with a straight razor and a soft spot for poetry than cooperate with the men trying to take him down. In the end, that trust outlasted every scheme, every setup, every armed young operator sent to replace him. Bumpy Johnson did not win his long war by fighting harder. He won it by being the kind of man an entire community refused to give up, while the man hunting him spent 30 years learning that some things cannot be taken by force, no matter how patient you are willing to be. It is worth sitting with how strange that ending really is. A man with money, muscle, badges in his pocket, and 30 years to work with still could not manufacture what Bumpy had simply by being the man he was, on an ordinary Tuesday in a barber shop or a church basement. You can buy a police report. You can buy a headline. You can even buy a prison sentence if you are patient and careful enough. What you cannot buy is a neighborhood standing in the cold to watch your casket pass. And that, more than any territory or any percentage of the numbers game, was the thing the Undertaker wanted most, and the one thing he never once managed to take. There is one more detail worth leaving you with. Years after both men were gone, a retired detective who had known them both was asked, in an old interview, who he thought actually won that 30-year war. He did not talk about money or territory or who ended up with more power on paper. He said the real answer was written in the two funerals. One packed a Harlem street from corner to corner. The other barely filled a single row of folding chairs. He said that told him everything he needed to know about who Harlem decided in the end was the better man. If this story pulled you in, stay with us, because Harlem in this era has 100 more stories just like it, buried under old case files and half-remembered names. Let us know in the comments which piece of this underworld you want us to dig into next.